Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today for the next installment in Grensbach Lear & Associates webinar series, Best Practices for Boards and Volunteers. Today's webinar is co-presented by Lori Musgrove, Senior Vice President and Managing Director, and Jim Liddy, Vice President. Lori Musgrove brings to clients more than 30 years of experience in fundraising for public and private universities in the performing arts. Her areas of expertise include assessing and building development programs, campaign planning and execution, mentoring staff in creating and executing cultivation strategies, and of course, board relations and volunteer management. Jim Liddy brings more than 35 years of experience in institutional advancement for healthcare and higher education organizations to clients. Prior to joining GG&A, Jim most recently served as Chair, Director for Department of Development with Mayo Clinic, where he was responsible for the leadership of the philanthropic program and the management of the Department of Development. In addition to his work in healthcare, Jim has also worked in the higher education sector at institutions including Fairleigh Dickinson University, Marquette University, Seattle University, and Georgetown. Today's session will explore the strategy of volunteer partnerships, discuss some challenges with boards and best practices for high-performing boards, discuss volunteer board expectations, and end with a brief case study. Our presenters welcome any questions you have during today's session, and we'll answer those questions in the time remaining at the end of the hour. To address a question to Lori and Jim, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, select all participants from the drop-down menu, and send us your questions. And you'll be receiving two messages from us next week, one with a slide deck or recording of the session and a short survey to gain your feedback, and another that addresses any questions we don't answer today, and will also include a few additional supplemental slides on this topic that you might find interesting. Thanks again for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Lori Musgrove to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Jim and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about this topic, and because we both in our own careers have worked with boards, worked with volunteers in key positions, and are well aware of some of the challenges and great opportunities that we face in working with our boards. We've structured this presentation to address certainly governing boards, but also some of your key leadership groups, advisory councils, visiting committees, etc. We're not going to go into some of the topics around governance or fiduciary responsibilities, but really talk today about those issues that we as development professionals often encounter in our work, in our own programs, but also in working with our volunteers. Joan, I am having trouble advancing the slides.
Just a second.
Well, while we're working on our technical difficulties, Joan has already provided you with a little bit of an overview of our agenda today, but let's talk a little bit about some of our frustrations. Working with volunteers and boards is, you could almost say we can't live without them, but we can't live with them. I often hear from clients that frankly, we can do it more easily if we just did it ourselves rather than trying to involve the boards and other volunteers. And the frustrations we often run into are things such as a misalignment. Perhaps our leadership volunteers are not particularly in sync with the goals, objectives, values, philosophies of our own institutions. Other challenges, perhaps you may have one or two volunteers who really become focused on one topic that for the institution is really on the fringe, something that's really not core to some of the work that you're trying to achieve. Often we talk at each other, that there's no real dialogue. Some of this could be a result of that single issue focus that I just mentioned. It could be personality conflicts, many issues that result in this. And I think probably the most frequent one is disappointment that expectations aren't met. Gee, we wish the board would do this, or they agreed that they were going to follow through in this area, and it didn't happen. But I also want to say that all of us, I'm sure, could speak to some really terrific relationships that we've developed with our board members. We often see every day the great commitment of service to the institution they're involved with, extraordinary philanthropy, connection with our students, our patients, docs, our musicians, and I think that's what motivates all of us to do this day after day. So let's talk about why we engage volunteers with our institutions, and particularly our boards. You know, today's nonprofit environment is complex, it's complicated, it's becoming more so. It's important, therefore, to make sure we have people available to us who offer a wide range of expertise, viewpoints, perspectives, and that's probably one of the most critical reasons we engage with folks and get them involved, deeply involved with our institutions. Costs are the cost to run our institutions, deliver the mission, make sure the services are provided appropriately and as widely as we can, are becoming more and more expensive. We have greater and greater financial risks facing us. And we, again, need that expertise and, again, the viewpoint of our volunteers who may be themselves active professionally in financial issues or simply have had experiences that they can bring to us. Many of you on the phone today are in higher education. Of course, having that expertise on your board as employers of the students, the graduates that will come through our programs. Others may be medical institutions or cultural organizations, and you have people who are consumers or those who enjoy the services that we provide. And so we want to make sure that we, in the area of employers, understand what the environment is. If we're strong in accounting, is that simply, or are we looking only at accountants to employ our graduates rather than perhaps a different sort of focus that's been evolving in the industry, in business today? So those are the some of the things that our volunteers certainly bring to the table on a day-to-day basis. Again, principal functions. Also, we want our board members to be knowledgeable advocates for our institution, for our work, for the challenges that we face. And as I mentioned earlier, too often we end up talking at our volunteers and not really engaging them in dialogue. Many board members that I've worked with and talked to over the years say, I don't want to come into a room 3 times a year and just be talked at. I want to be engaged. I want to understand what we're trying to achieve. And we have so much to do every day, and we think about these board meetings and the committee work that has to be done, and we forget that conversation is important, that our ability to help folks understand the intricacies, the subtleties, some of the dynamics of our work and our institution's mission is just as important as either collecting the gift or making sure they're attending meetings. My career that these high-level volunteers are bright, they're curious, They want to know more about the kinds of things they're involved with, and they're hungry for that kind of information. So it's important that we really spend time talking, having conversation, having dialogue about these things. Providing counsel and support for the strategic objectives. If you work for an institution that's landlocked, are there strategies that we can be talking about in terms of acquiring more land or working with a third-party company to help build the kind of facilities that you might want to access? Talking with you about, again, how you structure the outcomes. We need that perspective, that balancing of view. Professional expertise. We often talk about diversity on our boards, and that's a very broad topic that would include, again, professional expertise. Do we have legal folks at the table? Do we have IT? Again, if you're a performing arts or cultural organization, are there people represented on the board who have some expertise in the fine art market? That you want to make sure that you have that engagement so they can, again, provide an insight and help you, again, shape your work. Of course, philanthropic potential is very important. We hope our board members certainly have made this institution their top priority philanthropically. That's part of the recruiting, identification, and recruiting perspective. We hope that there'll be generous donors, but we also hope that there will be advocates for us in the need for additional private support of our institutions. So I see our slides have caught up with me, so I'll advance that. So providing advice and counsel to the CEO. Now, let's all be candid. The CEO sometimes is not as open to that as we might hope. We sometimes have to manage up so that there's that opportunity for the volunteer to be heard, and I think that you will hear me talk about this, Jim and I talk about this a bit, that, again, they want to be active partners, and so they want to be heard and engaged in a dialogue. So we have to work with our CEOs, our deans, our other institutional leadership who may not be as comfortable with that kind of dialogue. It's a fact of life in certain circumstances. Our volunteers, of course, bring credibility. People look to see who are on the board, who is on the board of our institutions. We want to make sure that we are thinking about those kinds of things when we recruit individuals. Do we have, again, that broad perspective, but do we also have appropriate stature that we might enjoy the situation where people seek roles with our institutions. Again, related to a comment I made earlier, we also hope our volunteers understand what we're trying to do, that they're comfortable with the culture, that they're in sync with it, and that, again, it's a good fit. Related to philanthropy, we need our volunteers to open their Rolodexes to us, that they're willing to use their networks and to speak on our behalf. In other words, to frankly stick their necks out a little bit on behalf of the organization that they are running. And then, of course, be good examples for others in modeling the behavior that we seek from the broader organization constituencies. I'm going to go through this a little quickly because it's related. I just want to highlight in the middle there, we have to listen. We have to engage in dialogue and not succumb to the very easy route of doing all the talking and not doing enough listening.
Hey, Lori, I'm sorry, this is Joan. I'm advancing the slides for you, so if you just let me know when to go to the next slide, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks. We talked a bit about perspective and feedback, advocacy, securing those critical resources, and this is not necessarily just philanthropic resources. While it's a changing landscape right now, public sources from our federal agencies as well as state, I would say it's even more important to keep those lines of conversation dialogue open because things hopefully will change. And we want to, it's just as we would say during the last recession, is don't abandon your relationships and your conversations with your private investors, your private philanthropists, because times are bad, because they're going to come back. And you, again, don't want to have to restart those conversations. So stay in touch. Talk with your volunteers about the importance of advocacy, about staying informed and being willing to gather more information if necessary. We often talk about campaigns and some of the reasons we do campaigns beyond the monetary goal. But part of that is to engage with people. It forces conversations. It forces us to learn more about our institutions. We want our volunteers to be as informed advocates. Important and tricky piece of this is, again, the partnership between staff and volunteers, and that the staff would also include the CEO of the organization. These need to be partnerships, and we hope to create relationships where certainly our staff members are positioned as professionals who have a perspective, who are at the table and can work equally with our volunteers in securing and reaching the objectives that we put in front of us. Often I observe occasionally in client situations where the staff feel like they don't have a voice, that they cannot push back a little bit in the most appropriate way, or have a dialogue with the volunteer about the value or course of action that the volunteer is recommending or wants to pursue. That's difficult. And those are situations where you want to make sure you're on the same page and have had the culture of the institution will support that, but it's a very important goal to work toward, that staff is able to interact with board members in an appropriate manner as another professional. I'm sorry, Joan, can you advance one more slide for me? And I'm going to hand the presentation off to my colleague, Jim Liddy.
Very good. Thanks, Lori. Joan, I can't see the slides, although I do have a hard copy here, so I won't be seeing you advancing these. I'm sorry. My task is to talk about the best practices of high-functioning volunteer boards and then to talk about the expectations of the CEO. And at the outset, Joan mentioned how long Lori and I have both been in this business. And when I think in terms of having been a vice president at a very early age, too early, at Seattle University in 1975, I think I've counted up that I've had the enormous privilege of being a part of boards of trustee meetings and governing board meetings and advisory board meetings that number well over a couple of hundred. And that doesn't mean anything except the fact that my blood pressure goes up 200 times a year, or 200 times over those years, because all of us are real concerned about the kind of information that we're delivering to boards of directors, boards of trustees, governing boards, volunteer boards, etc. These are individuals, as Lori said, who are successful individuals. They're composed of individuals who are personally committed to the mission of the organization and consider the institution among their highest voluntary and philanthropic priorities. We mentioned philanthropic priorities a number of times, and it can't go overstated, really. I'm amazed in the consulting work that I'm doing as to how many institutions still don't have that critical conversation when recruiting new board members. And that conversation goes something like this, in my opinion, when inviting someone to possibly join the board. And it goes, would you be willing to consider joining X board and making this institution among your top 1 or 2 or 3 priorities for your charity during the life of your tenure on the board? And so that so many people today still are saying, well, I was never recruited with any fundraising in mind, and yet that's a passé perspective, although we all know that there are specific board members who are recruited for specific talents. I still think that those individuals should be questioned about whether or not they're willing to make the institution among their top 2 or 3 highest philanthropic priorities during their tenure on the board. Very, very important. I also think that in the composition of the board that the president and CEO of the institution should really get to know the individual. A number of times, and I've been involved in these institutions as well, where another board member would advocate for a new member to come on the board, and that person is totally unknown to the president or any of the other leadership within the institution. And the person will come on the board, be voted on the board, and that creates a dilemma for the president, for his cabinet or senior leadership, because he or she does not know what that particular board member is thinking, what their perspectives are on a whole variety of things. So too often have I seen personally where someone has just been brought on without the president knowing that person, and I would advocate strongly for the president to accept a recommendation from another board member and simply make sure that over a period of 2, 3, 4 months that he or she gets to know that person very, very well and knows some of the thinking and finds the alignment between that thinking and the needs of the institution and how someone could serve on the governing board. So that's pretty important, I think. As far as the roles and responsibilities go, high-functioning boards possess really a clear, consistent understanding between the board and the CEO, the board's role, just mentioned that, and that of the CEO and the institutional staff. We're finding increasingly that presidents are so busy, whether it's in the fundraising area or in political policy areas with the state challenges and our federal government challenges, et cetera, that more and more there are senior leadership who are taking on interaction with board members, and that's really important that the board members and that senior leadership get to know one another in a very respectful way. And then high-functioning boards enjoy the support and leadership of the CEO is committed to building a strong governance structure. None of these individuals today, and this has increased over the years kind of dramatically, no one really wants to come to a board meeting and, as Lori said, just be preached to and talked at. This is one of the biggest challenges from my perspective, is to make sure that you have engaging dialogue with board members and that they have an engaging dialogue between and among themselves. And there are certain things that can be done to encourage that. For example, you can have conversations prior to board meetings with specific board members who have an interest in a certain topic, who can raise that topic among his or her colleagues at the board session. And there are other things, too, in the communication way that presidents can reach out to board members intermittently. A letter from the president to the governing board members once or twice in between meetings with a real array of the kinds of things that are going on at the institution, and then to make sure that there's a call to that particular trustee or governing board member prior to the next meeting to talk about some of those issues and to see where his or her interest might be. And then that would signal to the CEO and his or her leadership team that this particular individual might be willing to step up and carry the dialogue within the board meeting itself. Next slide, please. So high-functioning volunteer boards have a sound operating structure and with staff resources to assist the board and its committees. Increasingly, we're finding dedicated staff for board members, for the board meetings. There's just so much in the way of information today in our digital world, et cetera, that we have somebody, some places it's 2 staff members, some places it's a quarter of one person's time. But to have someone dedicated to be able to communicate with the board is really important, particularly as information comes into the institution from board members, so that those board members know whom to contact when not just picking up the phone and calling the president and expecting an immediate response. So that's an increasing qualification, really, for a high-functioning volunteer board. High-functioning volunteer boards also operate in a manner that's consistent in support with policies and procedures established by the institution's governing boards. And Lori touched on this as well, and all too often, I think we find some people who are out of step with the institution. And while this can be very healthy, it can also be very challenging and somewhat disruptive if there's not a good communication in between the board meetings with the president, CEO, and his or her leadership team and various board members. So that's very important. Stated expectations. High-functioning teams have board members that have stated expectations for themselves and for the institution, including participation expectations and fundraising activities and committee service and program activities and process to address non-compliance. All too often we think that trustees or governing boards are there just to solve the vexing problems when there's a non-compliant issue or what have you, and while that's very important as well, they really do increasingly like to be part of the life of the institution as well and contribute their expertise in meaningful ways. Next slide, please. High-functioning volunteer boards, they meet frequently and as is needed, fully and adequately conduct the business of the organization, and typically 2 to 3 times a year. Some meet 4 times a year, with committee work obviously occurring outside some of the formal board meetings. And these are often defined by bylaws. Some institutions have gone to 3 board meetings a year plus 1 retreat a year. A retreat might be held on a Friday morning, all day Friday, and a dinner Friday night, off campus, off site, and then a Saturday morning meeting in which the president brings senior leadership to be integrated with the discussion with the board. So places I've been usually have 3 or 4 meetings, and one of those typically could be a retreat meeting. High-functioning volunteer boards also prepare minutes for the boards reflecting the actions of the boards and including reports of the board committees when acting in the place of the full board. And these minutes are maintained and distributed to board and committee members. I found that committee meeting minutes are really, not only board meeting minutes, but committee meeting minutes are really important, particularly as there's an evolution of the board and new board members are brought on. I remember one board member who really asked for the last 5 years of a specific committee. It was an academic affairs committee. And she wanted to read up on just everything that occurred, and it made her a better board member. That kind of diligence was very helpful, and to have good minutes is really important. And then, obviously, maintain policies and procedures to address the initial assessments of screening of potential candidates and the assignment and training of appropriate work responsibilities for members with ongoing supervision, evaluation, and opportunities for advancement. And excuse me, Lori touched on that as well. Over on the next slide, we talk about access to information and agendas, access in an ongoing way to important information, coupled with well-constructed board and committee agendas that focus the members' time and energy on key governance priorities. Very important that the time be used very, very well, and that the minutiae is kept out of the boardroom, and that the priorities are the types of things that tend to keep board members focused. effective board meetings concentrate on matters that involve things like interactive discussions and deliberations, and as Lori said, don't just talk at them. Very, very important. I think the most vexing concerns that board members have is when they come to meetings and they're lectured to. They have a binder perhaps, and they're just lectured to or at, and they're not asked questions, and they're not asked to really use their expertise. So high-functioning volunteer boards also provide committee agendas that are linked directly to key strategic issues and governance priorities. And many boards are wrestling with strategic plans and the value of those strategic plans, and whether or not a strategic plan stays on the shelf or whether it has a virtual liveliness to it these days. And more board members are seeing that if they are involved in adopting a strategic plan, that they take a specific interest in making sure that particular strategic plan gets implemented. And then board culture is important. It's characterized by proactive engagement of its members, consistent pattern of constructive dialogue and debate, enlivened decision-making process, and ongoing self-assessment. The self-assessment piece, I think, is really, really important. I wouldn't advocate doing it more than every other year. That's what I've seen is the best, but good boards really do want to assess their attendance. They want to assess their agenda, their various agendae, and how they performed in helping to shape the institution's policy and how they helped in governance or compliance issues. And then they possess, obviously, a sustained organizational commitment to a solid board development program. And there are a number of organizations now that will come in and work with your boards and provide the kind of training and expertise that will help them do the kinds of self-assessment that's important in today's world with Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. I want to shift to the what a CEO should expect of volunteer board members. And there's just one slide here. And
Jim, could I jump in for just a minute?
Sure.
On the topic of the culture of the board and establishing a framework for this interaction that you and I have been talking about, can be a very challenging long-term goal that may require very careful recruitment and conversations with the CEO, and then with the recruitment of new leadership or leadership for these boards. I can see in a number of environments, and I've mentioned this before, that the CEO may be uncomfortable with this kind of dialogue, may in fact feel that his or her authority is being threatened, and so that symbiosis between the CEO and the board chair is critical, that the chemistry and their trust and respect for each other. And this goes back to, as we identify candidates for board roles, is to, again, that getting to know you process is absolutely critical, because ultimately that new board member that's coming on down the road may be the new chair or vice chair or some other leadership role. And so that the process of building the relationship between the CEO and his or her individual board members and recruiting to that, there's no magic formula except that that goal has to be out there all the time. And I see in several of my own client cultures where that's a very difficult goal to achieve. It's tough on those of us who have supported or currently support volunteers, and also who have to work with the CEO. to almost, we're put into a role of mentoring and coaching the CEO. In some cases, bringing in an external executive coach. Again, and I'm saying this, and I'm sure around the room there are a lot of eyes rolling. Easier said than done, but these are the kind of tough conversations and work sometimes that needs to be done for the benefit, for the good of the institution. So I just wanted to jump in a little bit to, you know, we recognize there's not a manual sitting out there.
Right.
That if you simply check these things off, so much of it is interpersonal, is the chemistry between leadership, both volunteer and institutional leadership. It's as Jim just said, a commitment to good governing structures and process, and a commitment to changing the culture. I've seen it done. It can take a while, and it has to be a commitment on both the part of the institution and the board. So, Jim, I'll stop now and let you.
But let me just add to that the really terrific meetings that I've seen have had a spontaneity to them, and when that spontaneity occurs, it's terrific when there's alignment with the institutional's objectives and the president's ethos, et cetera. When it's not, that's where the trust between the president and the chairman of the board really needs to be intact, because the board chair can absolutely contribute to a major derailment or can help to take this offline and have some discussion in the committee setting, et cetera. But the spontaneity of issues and the eruption of that is typically really, really good, but the president needs to know his or her board for sure. I would agree with that.
Right.
What a CEO should expect of board members: collaboration for sure, and that means good dialogue, not just the morning of the board meeting or the dinner that night or what have you, but in between. And there are lots of communication vehicles that can be implemented in order to help with that collaboration. Initiatives and ideas. Institutions are always looking for the terrific ideas from people in the community or who have experiences on other boards, and would bring that perspective to another institution. We sometimes say when we're institutional based that they don't always get us, and they sometimes derail us, as I was just talking about, whether inappropriately intrusive. And almost every board has that one naysayer or someone who is just zigging and zagging just a little bit with the rest of the board or with the president and senior leadership. So it's important that that voice be heard, but that also be constructive in any dialogue. Too many board meetings have been disrupted with lack of really good relationships, and that's chairman of the board not being able to control the dialogue. Follow-through is really important. It is a commitment to completing agreed-upon tasks in a timely way. These people are usually, as we all know, very much doers in their respective worlds and their communities. And so holding people to timelines is not a real chore for them. That's what they expect, obviously. A commitment and a serious and almost passionate commitment to the board's programs and goals. Very important that that commitment be manifested in many ways, philanthropy being one of them, but their enthusiasm, their participation at meetings, et cetera, would really be important. And when people are not communicating within the board setting, there's some shy and reticent people who are on the board. Behooves the president to find out if there's something that is not in sync with this person's alignment with the institution. And I've seen that happen a number of times where the president has initiated conversation because someone just seems to be not in alignment. Resource development. Most volunteers are uneasy about soliciting, and only occasionally are they particularly good at it. We know that in this business that all of us are privileged to be in. We know that some people can can be taught how to ask and how to partner with development officers or with presidents. But it's important to not put people into experiences where they're going to simply not be comfortable and therefore emit the wrong kind of signals to prospective benefactors. And then their own giving we talked about, to make this among their highest 2 or 3 philanthropic priorities. Again, I would say that my experience has been that with the clients I work with, that more than half of the institutions have not had the conversations with board members coming in and are still not having those conversations today about what's expected of them from the standpoint of philanthropy, particularly if you're embarking upon a campaign or thinking about a campaign, to ask someone to participate regardless of their previous philanthropic overture toward the institution. But while they're on the board, to make this a priority is an important issue. So I'll turn it over to Lori now to drive us home here.
So conversely, what should our board members expect of the CEO? Again, as we've talked here throughout the hour, they want to be included. So calling them with the good news as well as the bad news, giving them opportunities to view some of the inner workings. Again, going back to that chemistry and relationship with the institution and the willingness to share and help them become informed advocates where they can speak confidently about what the institution is all about. Again, to be heard. We brought them on the board for some reason. These are, again, successful people in their own fields in the region, and they understand they came within the organization for some expertise, and so we simply need to have the courtesy, the real genuine interest and courtesy to listen and have a dialogue with them. Again, regular communication in whatever form that may be. I'm always surprised when I run across a situation where board members say, I only hear from the president at board meetings. There are few or no communications in between, unless, of course, something not good has happened and the board needs to be informed of that. So both formal and informal outreach, phone calls, emails, I don't know, Twitter if you have a CEO that actually knows how to do that. Again, just a way to, not to inundate, but again, to include them, to make sure that they are able to respond to outreach and have some thoughtful comments or views to share. As Jim and I both have talked about a little bit, the documented expectations, so often it just simply comes down to lack of clarity about the long-term expectations. We're perhaps a little fearful or hesitant to make the role seem too demanding or require too much time or financial support, and so perhaps we hedge our bets a little bit in being candid. So having written expectations that are shared on the front end, I've even seen it go so far as the institution asks the new board members to sign these expectations. I'm not quite sure what prompted that historically. And then that they are referenced. Again, Jim's talked a little bit about a board assessment that would include an evaluation against those expectations, just a reference to see how are we doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute on the case about then these conversations need to occur. We often talk amongst ourselves, gee, trustee X, he never comes to a board meeting and doesn't make a gift, and it's so frustrating. But has anybody actually sat down with trustee X to talk with him or her about what the reasons are behind this perceived lack of performance? Again, let's make sure that our volunteers, our board members are really knowledgeable, that they understand the ways we evaluate our institutions, our work, that they understand it, that there's a willingness to listen to challenges or questions about those things. Treatment as a special citizen. They are giving us their time, their thoughtfulness, their finances. They are real models for the commitment of the way that others can support our institutions. And so I'm not talking about going over backwards, but just simply perhaps an occasional phone call to say thank you, to acknowledge their attendance at events, to make sure they're able to meet perhaps a student or a researcher in a medical center. But let's make sure that they know we appreciate every day what they're doing. As Jim has said, again, getting to know board members and making sure we understand their comfort level with certain roles that we may ask them to play, and making sure that we match that well. Again, we know that not everybody enjoys or is particularly effective at fundraising, but would they be willing to simply introduce the CEO to somebody and then let institutional leadership take that over? So understand what their comfort level is, what they're good at, and then making a good match with that. And then, of course, appropriate recognition. Again, it's a curious thing that I see much too often is once an individual goes off a board and perhaps they've served for 6, 9, or more years, they sort of fall off the face of the earth. We forget to take advantage of that accumulated wisdom and knowledge that they have about our institutions, and we just fail in our programming to keep those folks involved. So, I often hear conversations about, we have trustees, we can't defer to these old folks, quote unquote. But again, it's just a wealth of knowledge, and they've demonstrated their commitment over a long period of time, and so let's not lose sight of those folks. So let me tell you a little bit about
Lori, before you get to the case statement or the case study, let me just mention that at Mayo Clinic we had our first ever comprehensive campaign that started in 2005. They had a campaign before to build some facilities in Jacksonville, but this was the first comprehensive campaign. And we had we thought we might be able to have some leadership volunteers, and so we set up 7 leadership councils, and one was an alumni council, one was in Jacksonville, one was in Arizona, and one was in Rochester, and then a cancer one, a disease-based leadership council, which surprised all of us in thinking that you could actually rally around leaders, volunteers, and a leadership council around a disease, and then a couple of cities, Chicago and Washington, D.C. And in the 231 volunteers that we had in that campaign, I remember the CEO telling us that the biggest thing that he wanted to strive for was to make these people feel like total insiders. And that meant that they had privileges from the standpoint of understanding new research that would be coming out, so they would get notices of this before it hit the media, and all other kinds of things within the institution, so that they felt totally like they were among the senior management team, but without that responsibility, but had access to incredible information well in advance of the general public. And so making your volunteer board members insiders is really a worthy goal, and it does pay off in dividends for sure. I just wanted to mention that before you get into the case.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Earlier this year, we were asked, and this is again going to be heavily slanted toward the philanthropic aspect of our boards and key volunteer bodies. We were asked to conduct a survey, a benchmarking survey of about 8 leading medical centers to get an understanding of the key factors that influence and affect philanthropy among our board members. And we did this through a online benchmarking survey along with some one-on-one telephone interviews. We defined the groups that we wanted to look at each medical center as being entities, permanent entities, so it wasn't an ad hoc committee that was formed to address some particular topic or project. The groups that we were evaluating were primarily focused on philanthropy, and that they had been created and supported by the institution. For those of you not familiar with medical center fundraising, there are lots of volunteer groups that form around individual research activities. Perhaps a family has created an event or run a golf tournament, et cetera. But so we wanted to look at those bodies who were formally associated in a permanent way and were formed by the medical center. So we ended up with some very interesting findings on this. First of all, the policies, as Jim and I have alluded to, the expectations and the policies for giving varied widely in terms of whether everybody was expecting to be solicited or if they were expected to only make annual gifts. I mean, it was really quite a variety. Most of them said that they were really striving for a more consistent approach to managing and supporting their volunteer groups. Jim mentioned this earlier, staff support, and you'll see a table in a second. We saw that it did not matter how much staff was in place to support the volunteer groups, the board, or, again, key other bodies, nor did it matter how much money was available to support these bodies. Did not seem to have any effect on the amount of money that was raised. The documented set of board expectations did not affect the amount of money that was given. What made a difference, the single criteria that we found that made a difference, was the fact that institutional and board leadership were willing to sit down with individual board members who may not be fully meeting the expectations to talk with them about that. And we found that only rarely, combined with that willingness to sit and have those hard conversations, it was also important to make that hard decision and take the next step to excuse some board members from their involvement, their participation. It might be at the end of a term. That was the most common timing, at some point when they were up for re-election. But it was a very illuminating project for both for me and the team, as well as the participating institutions. So I wanted to share that with you. We're running a little bit short on time. You've got a couple of additional slides that will be coming to you that will focus on that. But as you think about supporting your volunteer groups, an assigned support person, whether professional or administrative, is important because, as Jim noted, they've got to have a point of contact. It can't always be the president. Flow of information, answering questions, responding, all those kinds of things that come with volunteers are important. But the number of those staff people, whether in the President's office or in development, did not make any difference in the response to philanthropy, nor did the amount of money available to support these bodies make a difference. So Wanted to share that quickly with you, and I think now that really concludes the formal part. So, Joan, if we have any questions, Jim and I would be happy to respond.
Great. We do have a few questions. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lori. One of them was, what are your feelings on term limits for board members and the use of lifetime status? And another related question we got was about a scenario where they had a board member who had been on the board for too long, for 10 years, and sort of how that should be addressed. So do you think you two could speak to that issue?
I'm happy to speak to term limits. I'm fully supportive of term limits for a couple of reasons. First, you just need change. You need the ability to get fresh perspectives. The flip side for the volunteer is this is not a life sentence. They should have the opportunity to share their volunteer expertise and the time with other organizations should they choose to do that. And the availability of term limits allows them to do that without feeling as if they are abandoning or rejecting, or it's just a more comfortable way to transition folks on and off the board. Secondly, if you don't have term limits, you're going to have folks sitting on your board that have either lost their effectiveness, who have become disaligned, unaligned with the board, with the institution's priorities, and there's just no easy way to ask them to step aside. And so, you know, the common system is to have 3-year terms, perhaps with a limit of 3 terms. So 9 years, that's a long time, but it's a very common setup with some sort of a year or two in between before folks can be reelected, which again provides you with an opportunity to bring people back into the onto the board who are especially effective.
And on the issue of someone who's been on for too long, perhaps 10 years or longer, and it's politically imprudent to just ask that person to step down, that's, in my opinion, what the emeritus category is for, provided it has meaning. If that person is kicked into an emeritus status but is then ignored forever and ever, then obviously that's not that won't be satisfactory to that individual. So there are ways that you can improve the connection to the emeriti members, and that's how I would handle that. But each institution is different.
Jim, you say emeriti is the equivalent of the lifetime.
Yes.
Right. And again, I think those have to, going back to our earlier conversation, you need to have criteria by which you might invite someone to be a lifetime, because there may be people, again, that for whatever reason, you really want to move them onward away from your institution. And so, and you also have to manage the size of that group, because as we talked earlier, if there's programming for them, again, that group could grow quite large and become unwieldy. John, what was the last question?
The other question was about someone who'd been on the board for 10 years and how to sort of remove someone from a board who's past their as our participant put it, their sell-by date. Well,
I guess I presume this is a situation where there are not term limits, and so this person is not going to naturally rotate off. And so this might present an opportunity to then institute term limits. You want to divide up current board members so they would rotate off, they wouldn't all move off the same year. Now that requires, again, board commitment to instituting that change and making it happen. If there's not the will to do that, then I think there's a conversation that has to occur that, which is difficult and probably isn't going to make anybody happy. But if it's a particular problem, then it's to step aside. And none of us likes to do that. Hasn't happened very often in my career. But again, I think the best solution is a board decision to institute term limits, and that, of course, would likely require a change in bylaws and some other procedural things. Yeah, not a good situation. I don't envy whoever asked that question.
Thanks, Lori. And now we're out of time. We have a few more questions, but as I mentioned before, we'll ask our presenters, Lori and Jim, to address those in a follow-up email that will go out next week. And we'll also include, you'll also be receiving the slide deck. Apologies for the technology hiccup in the beginning there. But you'll receive the slide deck, the recording, and then responses to these follow-up questions, and a few extra slides that might be of interest in two separate messages next week. So thank you again, Lori and Jim, for a great presentation, and thanks to our participants for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.